More of the as simple as possible, as soon as possible, casual conversation, anatomy and physiology. We're on part 5, oops, 6 right here. We talked about what is anatomy, what is physiology, what are examples of those things. We talked about levels of organization. We compared meiosis to mitosis, and now we're going to put the whole package together and say, wow, schematically, here you are, with all those systems interplaying together to make you function. Now, to keep all these things working well, there's a process called homeostasis that we need to refer to. And homeostasis is a dynamic state of equilibrium. It's not just a balancing act, it's an ever-changing balancing act. The analogy that we may use in class, or the one I like to use, is let's say that you're a kid trying to play on a seesaw all by yourself. You can't sit on one side or the other, so what you do is you stand in the middle and you turn into a balance beam. And you get real good after a while with it, but there'll always be a little bit of wiggle at the end of the beam right here. You cannot be perfectly still for an extended period of time. Well, in this thing right here, it was a dynamic state of equilibrium because it looks like you're balanced, but in truth, you're constantly moving to maintain that illusion of balance. The same thing happens inside your body, and that is when it comes to things such as pH and temperature and chemical levels and such, there are no fixed numbers. They tend to vary, but the body tends to bring them back towards that, well, mid-range. Well, here we go. Back to the analogy here of the seesaw. If this kid right here, even if they're really, really good, were standing there, there'd be a little bit of wiggle on the end of the seesaw. That right there represents the range. And the range is around the midpoint or the set point. And when we talk about the simple numbers of clinical data and stuff like that, we tend to memorize the set point and then later on memorize the ranges. But the set point is where we're going to get started right here. Here's an example. When it comes around to how acid or alkaline your blood is, the set point for your blood pH is around 7.4. That's the normal right there, 7.4. Normal for the normal person, if ever there were a person like that. But the range is from 7.45 to 7.35. If you're at 7.4, you're fine. If you're within the range, you're pretty much fine. But if you go beyond the range right here, above 7.45, you get a condition called alkalosis, whatever the reason is. And if it goes below 7.35, it's called acidosis. And as we mentioned before, with acidosis, your nervous system tends to be suppressed. And with alkalosis, your nervous system tends to spike, and later on it crashes. So, pH of your blood is a good example of set point and range. By the way, if you're inside the range, you feel normal. It's only when you go outside the range and you are no longer in homeostasis that you call that a homeostatic imbalance. And that's another name for disease, because dis-ease means not comfortable. Dis-ease. Well, okay, let's look at something else here. Body temperature. Body temperature, so-called average, is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. However, there is an upper range, upper part of this range, where things begin to go wrong. So, for example, if your temperature goes up to 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius or above, you start having enough violent shaking in the molecules that things become damaged, denatured. And so now you're out of the comfort zone, you're into that disease situation. Now, how fast the damage occurs beyond 104, well, that's another topic. As far as what's the lowest temperature right here, well, that's a little clumsy because we can actually freeze tissues and then warm them up and they become reanimated. For example, sperm and embryos can be frozen and then warmed up and they become animated again. So the lower point of the range is not as obvious as the upper part of the range. Okay, some other ranges that we need to know right here are part of the vital signs that you might take when somebody comes into a clinic. So heart rate. If you have a higher than normal heart rate, it's called tachycardia, fast heart rate. If it's slower than normal, it's called bradycardia. For blood pressure, if your blood pressure is higher than normal, that's hypertension. Lower than normal is hypotension. Your respiratory rate, higher than normal, that's hyperventilation. Lower than normal, that's hypoventilation. And there's ramifications of all these things right here. And when it comes to blood chemistry, well, the level of water, you can be dehydrated or overhydrated. Being overhydrated is particularly dangerous. But most people are concerned about their blood sugar levels. If we had to sort of pick a characteristic number, 100 units is commonly used as far as the upper is concerned. All depends on who's writing the book, and the lower, whoever's writing the book. Here's an example of a homeostatic mechanism. Now, to maintain those numbers within that range, the body has to work to do things to keep those numbers in play. And here are the general features of a homeostatic mechanism. First off, for a mechanism to be activated, there has to be a change in the environment, a stimulus. If something changes, like blood sugar levels or body temperature, a receptor will recognize the change. The receptor then sends a signal to a control center. The control center doesn't think about it. The control center has a pre-planned response, and it will send a signal to an effector. An effector is usually a muscle or a gland, and what the muscle or gland does is called the response. Well, the response may directly or indirectly affect the original stimulus. And if there is a comparison between the response and the stimulus changing, that's called feedback. If the response makes the stimulus larger, that's called positive feedback. And if the response makes the stimulus smaller, that's called negative feedback. In the body, there's much more examples of negative feedback than positive feedback. But here's two for instances over here. Oops, okay. Let's talk about negative feedback. Blood sugar and insulin. Let's say, for example, you eat a really high sugar breakfast for some reason. You put way too much sugar inside your bloodstream. Your liver tries to store some of it away to use later. Your kidney begins to scrape some of it off to throw it away. And your body wants to save and utilize as much as it can. So your pancreas acts as a receptor. Acts as a receptor and recognizes that your blood sugar is too high. The pancreas acts like the receptor, the control center, and the effector. It recognizes your blood sugar is too high. It has a plan, and its plan is to act like a gland and make a hormone, insulin. The insulin will cause body cells to open up and allow that sugar to get out of the blood and get into the cells, either to be stored or to be used, thereby helping the liver do its job and denying the kidney the opportunity to just throw the stuff away. Well, because the insulin helps reduce the blood sugar level, that's an example of negative feedback. All right. An example of positive feedback is labor contractions and oxytocin. Okay. As the child is getting larger inside the uterus, it's pressing up against the walls. Pressure receptors inside the wall can recognize that the kid's getting big. It sends a signal to your hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus is your clock in your calendar, and it's monitoring how big that kid is, and it's monitoring how long has that kid's been there. And it knows when the child's supposed to be delivered. And it's using the size as one of the variables to decide will the child be delivered. If the pressure inside the uterus is going up, the child is getting bigger. And at a certain stage, the hypothalamus may release a hormone called oxytocin. The oxytocin will affect the smooth muscle in the wall of the uterus, causing the smooth muscle to constrict. When the smooth muscle that wraps around the uterus constricts, the uterus gets smaller. The baby didn't get smaller, however, so therefore the pressure inside the uterine wall goes up dramatically. That new higher stimulus stimulates the hypothalamus to send even more oxytocin to cause even more contractions. And so therefore the contractions get stronger and closer together. This is called positive feedback because the oxytocin makes the original stimulus more dramatic. Now, you can recognize this situation. This could be very, very dangerous because if you don't break this cycle, the child will die and the mother will die. So with positive feedback, there's got to be some point at which you can break the cycle. And delivering the child, relieving the pressure on the inside of the uterus, is that break in the cycle.